Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.dev and devnursery.com and all these other websites. And today what I want to talk about is custom elements, custom attributes, essentially a 2020-2024 review of, you know, web components. Okay, so first we're going to just talk about at the basic level. What if you just want custom HTML elements with custom attributes and things like that? Okay. Okay, so here we go. Boop. Okay, now first let me just create a couple files here. So actually I'll just open up the terminal and do that to save myself time. I'm going to create touch custom elements.html, and there we have that. Okay, set up some basic HTML boilerplate. Okay, now basically it depends on sort of what you're looking for. So at the most basic level, you can just literally just make up new HTML elements. The only general ask is that you don't use single word names. So in this case, I won't make up an element called counter. The reason being is that when you use single word names, there is a possibility that in the future, who knows, they might add an HTML element called counter. HTML elements will always just be a sort of a single word. So in that case, if you want to make sure that you use a namespace that's never going to collide with an existing HTML namespace, what they prefer is what you do is you kebab case. So one fun example is what if I wanted to create a more semantic flexbox. Okay, so basically have an element that I know is a flexbox when I look at it in my code. I can just literally write flexbox and create a flexbox HTML element. Now, at this level where I literally just created it out of thin air, it's just a glorified span. So it's an inline element, has no default styling. It's just a DOM node, okay, at its most basic level. But again, I can target this in my CSS. So just to show us this as an example, let me put this in live server. So you can see that open up over here. There it is. And let's imagine that I create a flex box with many different flex items. Each of them with like we'll just say with the word, well, yes, let's just do one. And we'll do 5 of these. Okay. 2, 3, 4, 5. Cool. And now I can style it. So we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 right now are in a row on the screen over here. And let me actually just blow this up a little bit. So you can see they're in a row because right now they're inline elements. So they're just going to show up in a row, but they're not blocks. So I can't do all that fun, a lot of the cool stuff you can do with blocks, like borders, all that kind of stuff. So let's do a style tag so we can actually style these. Okay, first I'll style the flex. Actually, what I'm going to do first is we'll do flex box. And then right now we'll just set the display to block for now. And then we'll do flex item display to block. So you can see if they were block elements, they're just going to stack on top of each other like a normal flex box type environment. And then I can change the box to flex. And now I'm getting sort of that normal flex box type environment. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, flex box, justify content, space around. And there we go. Okay, so basically bottom line, again, now when I read my HTML, I have this nice sort of semantic view. Again, nothing wrong with doing this. Again, the main rules is make sure they're lowercase because, again, you don't want them to, especially if you're using React, the React compiler determines whether something is an HTML element or a component based on the capitalization. Okay, so if I were to write capitalize flex item, then React would determine that it's a component and try to find a function called flex item. So, although generally probably wouldn't necessarily need custom elements with React because with React you have components or with any of those kind of frameworks. But if you're just writing plain HTML, this can be really, really useful. Now, another thing you can do is not only custom elements, you can do custom attributes. Okay, and same thing. You can just literally write anything you want. I can just write an attribute here called cheese. Okay, but generally the recommendation is that it should be kebab case, because again, you don't want to run into a collision with an existing property or an existing attribute. And generally, usually you'll use this to pass data around. So oftentimes the convention is to prefix this with data. So in this case, let's say I want to set the border for each of these to a different color. I can do something like data BG, we'll say data color, why not? Green, okay? And the cool thing is in CSS, I can grab those values, see if I remember how to do this correctly. So in this case, what I could do is I can go to that flex item, say, hey, that element has a border of 3 pixels solid, and then there should be a function called attr, if I remember right. And then here I would just put the name of the attribute, so it'd be data color. Okay, and that did not quite work the way I thought. Let me just remember how to use the attr function. So attr CSS. Okay. Choose and retrieve the value of an attribute. Use pseudo element. Yeah, I mean I used it pretty much the right way. See here, attr data foo. Okay. So we go back over here. Oh, and I think I know why. Just see here. Where did my HTML go? Here. I think it wants it to be the whole. Well, I should put an semicolon here. Let me refresh the page. Still not quite. So let's see if we do this. Add or data color, and if I were to do here 3 pixels solid green. Cool. Okay, so I did nothing wrong, but technically this particular property in CSS isn't quite widely supported across browsers yet. So right now you can use it, this attr function, you can definitely use it to grab the value of the attribute from for a content property. So usually you can inject something like, so let's see if I can just do a quick example of that. So if I were to do flex item before, okay, so this would basically inject something before. What I can do is then select the content, and here I should be able to use data color, and it should inject that text right beforehand. And see right there, it inject the value of the attribute right beforehand. So that should work across all browsers, but still browser support for being able to use attr as a way to pull the attribute value to any value in CSS. Not quite there yet. That'll be pretty exciting once it is in there. Okay, but yeah, so that's just a quick thing you can do with, so just as a quick summary, again, you can have custom elements, custom HTML elements, you can have custom attributes. The big ask is lowercase kebab, meaning having a dash, so a 2-part name with a dash in it. Attributes can be grabbed in CSS using the attr function, but right now they're only consistently working across all browsers if you're using them for the content property in a before or after pseudo selector. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually comment out that pseudo selector. But yeah, so that's the kind of thing you can do just with just plain HTML, CSS out of the box without doing anything too crazy. But what if you want these custom elements to have a bit more going on? Okay, what you can do is you can create custom elements and combine them with a JavaScript class. Okay, so let's actually show you an example of this. So let's create a new file, and we'll call this web components. Because basically, once you bring JavaScript into this, this becomes a web component. In the same way you might have React components, except built into the web standard. Okay, so once again, we'll just set up a basic HTML page. I'll close this one. I'll close these there. Open this in Live Server. Okay, and let's see here. I want to have a, we'll say, my counter. Okay, so what I want here is to show up is that when I use this my counter component, I want to actually see the counter. Okay, so let's see how that works. Okay. So the way this would work is, again, I'm going to need JavaScript. And then what I'm going to want to do is that I want to be able to track the state of this counter by having actually a variable called data counter. So we're going to say, hey, it starts at 0. That's the starting place for this counter. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Okay. So essentially what we have to do is we first have to create a class. So let me just save some space over here. And we're going to create a class, which we'll call myCounter, which extends the HTML element. Okay, so that's just basically the base class for all HTML elements. Okay, so there's my class. And then what we do is we register this class. So we're going to say, hey, custom elements dot define. And then what we do is we give it a name, which is going to be my counter. And we are going to have a, then we say which class those elements are bound with, my counter. Okay, awesome. Cool. Okay, so now anytime you see a myCounter element, it's going to be bound with a myCounter class. Essentially what it happens is that an instance of that class gets created, and essentially the object that that class is creating is the HTML element that is hitting the DOM. Okay, so this becomes the element. Okay, cool. So now I want some basic behavior at construction of this. So we can do a constructor. Okay, so we do a constructor. Okay, and in this constructor we have to call super because we're inheriting, so we need to make sure we call the parent constructor before anything else. Okay, now what I want to do is just first let's just show that it works. So what's going to happen is I can just do like this dot inner HTML, because again this is now the HTML element, and we'll just say, hey, it equals h1 the counter. Okay, and there we see. Okay, so we see now that when I use this HTML element, this class is taking over what shows up there. Okay, and again, in my JavaScript here, I can refer to it. Now, right now, this is inside the normal DOM. Okay, so it's just a node of the normal DOM, and I'm injecting some HTML into it. So nothing too crazy from what we did before. Usually what you'd want to do is you want to make these components reusable. So the idea is you want to isolate them from being dependent on things outside, particularly CSS. Okay, so the idea is that you don't want the CSS from the outside affecting it, because then when you load it up the same component in another page or something like that, that CSS can affect it. So typically what we're going to do is we're going to give this element a shadow DOM, which means its own little mini internal DOM that's shielded from any CSS files on the normal DOM. Okay, and the way we do that, so I'm going to delete this because we're not going to need this anymore. We're going to say, hey, this dot attach shadow. Okay. And this dot attach shadow takes in a object, and there's a property called mode, which we're going to use open. There's no real reason to ever use close. Close just means you cannot see it when you look in DevTools, which would make it kind of hard to debug. Okay, this dot attach shadow, mode open. Okay, cool. So now it has its own what's called a shadow root, which means its own sort of root. It is the root of its own DOM. Okay, so now in this case, if I want to put that same HTML, I would say, hey, this dot shadow root dot inner HTML, and then inject the h1. Okay, h1. h1 counter slash h1, and see we still see it right there. But now let me look at DevTools. So when we take a look in DevTools, okay, so if I go here, I go into the body tag, you see there's a myCounter element, and then I can see there's a shadow root, there's a shadow DOM, and inside of it is the h1. So you can see it has its own little DOM, and then there's like nodes inside that little shadow DOM. Okay, which are not affected by CSS. So if I were to do CSS here, so if I were to do a style tag here and say, hey, h1s are now have a text color of red, see, it's unaffected because again, it's shielded from any CSS that is styling the normal DOM. It's going to have its own style tag. Okay, so cool. But again, we want a counter. So usually what I'm going to do here, because I want to create something a little bit more responsive, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a render function, thinking, okay, the render function is going to render what should show up in that DOM. So in this case, this function is not going to handle this. Okay. Okay. So we're going to write a render function. And what this render function will do is it's going to always basically render a view of the count based on the data counter attribute. So what I'll do is I'll go get that attribute. Okay, so we'll say, hey, like const count equals this dot get attribute, and I will get the data counter attribute. Okay, so that's going to be the count. Okay, and then what we can do is we'll say, hey, this dot shadow root dot inner HTML. Okay, equals, use backticks. And we'll say, hey, we're going to have a h1 counter. h1 counter. Cool. h1 dot counter, h1. Then here we'll put like h3 with the count. Okay. And now this function will run every time in the constructor. So I'll just now say this.render happens right after we attach the shadow. And see, now I see the counter. Okay, cool. But right now the counter doesn't quite update. Okay, so now I want to kind of take care of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of handle that in a write a function. Let's see here. How do I want to best handle that? I'm going to want to select that element. Okay. So essentially what I'm going to do is want to do like this dot query, not this dot shadow root dot query selector, because again, you're selecting from the shadow DOM, not the normal DOM. So you need a special query selector that's in that particular shadow root, because you're scanning that DOM tree, not the main DOM tree. Okay, and what I want to grab is the h3 for now. Okay, and then I'm going to do dot add event listener and say, hey, whenever you click on this, what that's going to do, and again, that's going to get the event. Okay, what that's going to do is, and what I'm going to do here though, is I am going to create a variable called self, which equals this. Okay, so the idea is that's going to basically make sure that I lock in the attribute into a variable. Okay, so basically what I want to do is I want to get, because again, in the context of this function, this is now going to be that h3. Okay, because it's the h3 that's invoking the function, just because, again, the way function binding works in JavaScript. So I got to be careful for that. Okay, and then I'm going to do self dot get attribute, or I should do self dot set attribute. Okay, and then just I should probably make this parse int, make sure that's treated as a number. Okay, so self dot set attribute, and the attribute I want to set is data count, if I remember right, data counter. And then I want to set that to count plus 1. Okay, cool. So that's going to end up changing the attribute, but that doesn't cause the thing to update. So like if I click on this, like, and then just to kind of prove it out, what I'll do is let's take a look over here. So you see right now, my counter, data counter is 0. If I click on it, see it goes 1, and well, that in that case it just stops. Okay, so it changes, but nothing then happens. Okay, so what I'm going to want is something to happen whenever that occurs. So what I'm going to do is, whenever that attribute changes, I want something to happen. So what we do is we create a attribute changed callback. If I remember correctly, let me just double check. Pretty sure it's attribute changed callback. Okay. Yep, attribute changed callback. Okay, good. Okay, so this is again, you're just basically overwriting a function that already exists. And then what you do is that in this function, we're going to put basically what's going to happen here is you're going to have the name of the attribute. So this function receives 3 things. The old value, so it receives the name, the old val, and the new value. So essentially what I want to do is check, hey, which attribute changed? So in this case, I want to say, hey, if the attribute that changed, if name equals data counter, okay, then what I want to do is basically say, I'm going to want to rerun this .render again. Okay, so that way it re-updates the DOM for the new reality. Okay, so let's try it out now. Refresh. Okay, so right now that's not having the desired effect. So let's kind of understand why. Let's go to the console here and see what's happening here. Attribute changed callback. So in that case, h1 counter, set attribute data.counter. I'm not getting any kind of error. But still stuck at 1, so I want to do a hard refresh. Okay, so it's still updating the attribute. But not necessarily running this.render. Although I actually really don't need to do that. I could just do this. Every time you set the attribute, I can just do self.render here. Because again, I have the element right there, so I can just call its render function to update itself. And then here we go. And then that works. Okay, so you can create like basic reactivity like that. Okay, just call the render function whenever any of these attributes change. Okay, so you could again use attribute state as, or use your attributes as a place to store state. You could sit there and say, hey, you know, you store it as a JSON object or something like that. It can get a little tricky when you start trying to store larger amounts of state. So it gets a little, there's other patterns you can use. So again, at the end of the day here, you have a clear canvas about far as how you handle reactivity. This is just one example. Cool. But that's essentially what a custom element is. Okay, at the end of the day, it's a class that you bind to a HTML element. So basically, I have my custom element, which is my counter, and I'm binding this functionality, turning it into a full-blown web component. Now, there's some other cool stuff you can do. So again, right now, I can't style this h3, right? But what I can do is I can give it a name. I can say, hey, this name has called a part, and its name is going to be count. Okay. Now what I can do is that if I were to create that style tag again, if I style h3s and say, hey, h3s are color red, that won't have an effect on this h3 over here because again, shadow DOM. But if I were to say, hey, h3, okay, part. Okay, and then here I say, hey, the h3 is a part called count. I think that's what I called it. Count. Okay, should start taking effect. Actually, I'm supposed to target the element. So in this case, I would target my counter. Okay, and you see now that style is red because I'm saying, hey, in the my counter element, specifically in that element, style any part that has the name of count. Okay, and that'll allow you to target things inside of the component. So basically, if I'm creating a component for future use and I do want it to be styled, I can expose only the parts I want to be styled using this part deal. Okay, cool. Another cool thing you can do is you can actually expose different states. Okay, so for example, what we can do here is now we can say, hey, this dot, and what we do is we choose, it's like this dot internals. Actually, it's like this dot attach internals. Okay. And then we need to attach this to this. So it'll be like this dot underscore internals equals. And what this does is going to allow you to kind of be able to manipulate the internal state of the element, and then you can actually style that state. Okay, so for example, let's say let's say here every time that we update this thing, okay, we're going to update the, so we're going to say, hey, if count modulo 2 equals 0, so if it's even, then we're going to say, hey, this dot internals dot add. Okay, then what we can do is we can add, and we can say, hey, we want to add even. Okay, else it's this dot underscore internals, and I think it's remove even. Okay, let me just double check on that. CSS underscore this dot underscore internals CSS. Okay. Okay, so it's dot states. So that's what was missing. Dot states dot add, and then this is dot states dot delete. So the idea is I'm adding and removing a state. Okay, and the cool thing is now I can style this element based on that state. Okay. So what I can do now is I can actually put, like, let's say a custom styling in this. So I can just say, hey, here in the styling, what I want to do is I want to style that H3 a little bit differently if we're even. Okay. So again, here in the styling, what I can do is I can target the host. The host is the host element. Okay, and then I can target the host when it is, so you can see over here as an example. See, I can say, hey, when the host is checked, okay. In this case, I want to say, hey, when the host is even, I want to style, in this case, when the host is even, I want to style the H3. That's really all I want to do. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is say, hey, when that is the case, I want the border to be 3 pixels solid green. Okay, so then theoretically, whenever that number is even, we should, which right now it's not quite giving me that effect. Okay, and then basically what I was missing was this colon right here. So I just added that colon there, and then now it works. And see, now whenever I'm in an even state, I can style specifically that state, okay, reflective of its value. So the idea is I can tag it with a particular state. And again, you can do this other ways. You can actually just add a class and, you know, in the same way that I've added this state. But what you can do is you can then, for example, in the sample code they have here for this checkbox, they're able to replicate sort of like a checked state by basically setting a getter and setter that sets the state, that basically sets the state value instead. So you can, you know, give it some sort of make it feel like a little bit more native if you want. Okay, so you can do that. Last thing to talk about is slots. Okay, so basically what happens here with a slot is that in your template, what I can do is I can add a slot tag. Okay, and actually let me put this right here so you can see that I can put it wherever I want. Slot / slot. Okay, and what the slot does is going to say, hey, whenever if I were to actually put some code here in my elements, if I go back to the HTML and I put something right here in the wrapper, I can say, hey, like, let's just say, let's actually use a marquee. Why not? Marquee. Hello. Okay, so you see this marquee shows up right here in between because that's where the slot was. Anything I put inside my counter will show up here. And the cool thing is I can actually style it. So I can say, hey, if there is a target that specifically, I can say, hey, if there's a marquee that is slotted, okay, if there's a marquee that is slotted, I want that one to have a color of blue. So the font color will be blue. Okay. That one didn't quite turn blue. Okay. And that's because the slotted is actually a function. So technically what I want to do is move that out of here and then put that in here. So I'm saying, hey, if it's a slotted marquee, okay. And then I probably want to put my element or my counter. Okay. But that's right. It needs to be in the shadow DOM because it's slotted. It still exists within the shadow DOM. So the idea here is that I can target things that are slotted in my element from my styling here. So I can be like, hey, if there is a slotted marquee specifically, then we'll do the color of blue. And there we go. We got the effect. Okay, so basically the idea here is like how part allows you to style things in the shadow DOM externally. The slotted pseudo class allows you to slot things that are external to your shadow DOM because they were brought in through a slot, and be able to still style them internally. Okay, so you can style either way. So that's the way to think about that. And another cool thing you can do with slots is you can have multiple slots. If I remember right, the slot should have a name attribute. Okay, so and I can sit here and say, hey, name below. And then I think, if I remember right, if I were to add another marquee. Goodbye. Right now it's going to show up in the same place because they're both, but then I think I can specify the slot by using a slot property, and then I can specify the loss and say, hey, this one belongs in below. And see, now that one is below. Okay, so I can actually put multiple slots and then allow people to target where they want the stuff that they've slotted in to show up based on the name of that slot, giving you some more flexibility. So you have a lot of flexibility what you can do. You can pretty much inject any kind of JavaScript logic you want in here to make it do whatever you want. Okay, again, you can isolate the styling, and there's ways for you to access the external and to access the external from the internal using the slotted or the slot API, and you can access the internal from the external using the part selector. And yeah, that's basically custom elements if you want to get really fancy about it. There's a lot of more cool things you can do. I've done a lot of previous videos over the years on custom elements and web components showing different ways to handle reactivity. That you can use proxy objects. You could try to put JSON in an attribute and use that as a way to handle reactivity. You can do all sorts of things. So you can really have fun with it. But hopefully you guys enjoy that. My name is Alex Merced from Alex Merced Dev. If you like this, again, like the video, subscribe, leave a comment. Have a great day and enjoy.